Now, to get started with the presentation, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our Business Consulting Director and expert in all things related to the complexities of compliance, David Gwynn.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for that lovely intro music. Trying hard not to dance along with it. So thank you for joining us today as we introduce our new Compliance Center solution, both the process and methodology and a software platform. And anxious to share that with you today. And joining me today are three of my colleagues who are well versed in the validation space. And in order of appearance, let me introduce them for you. Hannah Wood, a consultant from the business consulting practice, will be introducing the concept of the new way of validation, if you will. And Matt Peterson, also from my business consulting practice, will be digging more deeply into the rigors of that process and the risk-based approach specifically. And then Alicia, who is from our technical services team and who has been the heartbeat of the development of this solution, will share a demo of the platform portion of this so you can see it live and in action. So thank you all, and you'll see them return as they present their pieces going forward. So for the purposes of today, what I want to share with you is a brief overview of who is FME, just very quickly, and then dig in the background of how did we get here? We've been doing validation for a while. What's new? What's different? And why do we need to listen today? And I think I've got some very compelling points to share. And we'll get into this computer software assurance, which I'll introduce in a moment, and its benefits and give you some background to that. And then Alicia will guide us through a demo. And please feel free, as Brian noted, to use the Q&A box to address any questions. So briefly, who is FME? So we've been in business for over 20 years. We started in the non-life sciences space, specifically in the automotive industry, but branched out in banking, finance, and other manufacturing areas. But over 10 years ago, we expanded into the life sciences space specifically. And if you've heard of FME before, you may have heard us initially in migration space, but we've evolved well beyond that, which I'll get to in a minute. But our focus has been in pharmaceutical and life sciences, specifically in regulatory, quality, and clinical areas. But of course, that breeds movement into medical device areas and other factors within the life sciences space. So how are we organized? And we are organized, like you may have heard or used in phrases, the people, process, technology type of area. So as I mentioned, our roots were deeply ingrained in the migration area, migration services. This was based on our product called Migration Center, where we move a lot of content from A to B in multiple places in between. We have solutions like Metadata Assist that provide business process outsourcing through AI to help classify your content and prepare it for migration. We've got a number of solutions in that area. And then not only do we help you move the data there, but our technical services team helps implement those platforms, whether it's Viva, Generis, Enov, what have you. We can help implement those applications through configuration, testing, and validation, and so forth. And we'll talk more about the validation, of course, today. But not only do we get the software implemented and the data there, but if we have that expertise, then of course, providing managed services to keep the lights on, keep that application running over time is something we do quite well as also. And we have a solution offering called Platform Assist that can help you outsource those activities and manage that and provide assistance at whatever scale you need. Now, surrounding all those technology services is the business consulting area, which I lead, and that's your typical business consulting, so requirements analysis, process modeling, and that evolves then into training and validation and so forth. So that's where this is coming from. It's a business consulting offering, but of course it takes technology and all these other capabilities into play. So we hope you'll see that as we go through today. So moving on to the background of why are we here? What is different? Well, for those of us who have been around for quite a while in this industry and have gray hairs like I do, remember back in 1996 was when the FDA released its first computer software validation guidance, and it became approved. 1996, so quite a while. Well, 15 years later, around 2011, they did this case for quality initiative to look back over the past 15 years to say, what's happening? How are things going? And back in 2011, they realized that the rigor placed by the mountain of paper produced in the validation process was holding companies back, and it wasn't doing its job. So in 2011, they did a study, or later, they did a study of looking at, in the med device world, if they looked at all the recalls of medical devices that had a software component, how much of that was a software validation issue. And they found 79% of the software issues were validation or testing issues that didn't catch problems on software upgrades and so forth. So even though we had this mountain of paper, we were focused in all the wrong directions. We weren't catching the problems. We weren't focused on the patient. And if your pacemaker isn't working, that's a problem, right? So we had to improve the quality. So it's taken some time as governments move perhaps a little slower than we may want them to at times. But finally, in 2022, just in November of last year, they released a draft guidance called the Computer Software Assurance Approach, which is intended to be a risk-based approach focused on those things that could cause harm, could be a problem. And we'll see, explain that more by the rest of the team throughout the webinar. But it's a major shift, getting away from the likes of, for anybody who's been in life sciences for a long time, we've been using Documentum since the early 90s, right? And how many times in those pieces of paper you see on the screen did we test the login capability of Documentum? Well, in 2023, we don't need to do that anymore, right? We didn't need to do it 10 years ago, but we still did it because if we didn't test it, an inspector might cause us harm, right? They may give us a violation. So this is a different way. It's an efficient way. It's a much more focused way. And what I'd like to do now is turn that over to Hannah to explain how different it actually is. Hannah?
Awesome. Thank you, David. So, first and foremost, CSA stands for Computer Software Assurance, and it supports quality and patient safety by emphasizing critical thinking, assurance needs, testing activities, documentation. It follows a risk based approach that suggests leveraging critical thinking, risk assessments, documentation to reduce the overall burden of testing while ensuring no negative impact to patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. CSA requires the business to follow a robust risk assessment process, which requires a great understanding of the software and related functions. It's important to add that CSV is not going away. Riskier applications will always require rigorous validation, but CSA is just a better and easier way to perform CSV. So the benefits of CSA, there are many. It reduces script testing, which leads to reduced errors. Low risk and medium risk testing do not require supporting evidence such as screenshots, which also saves a ton of time. Low risk testing may not even require pre-approval, which also saves a ton of time. Validation time is cut in half with faster implementation. There's lower overall project costs, higher quality and productivity, and you spend more time on critical thinking instead of generating the documentation. So that leads us to Compliance Center. Compliance Center is an electronic-based paperless CSA validation method that is also able to do CSV testing. Don't uh, think it can only do CSA because it could do both. We will follow a risk-based methodology approach for validation of computer systems dependent of the intended use of the system. This approach is used to determine which requirements and system functionalities matter most, such as patient safety and product quality. The complexity of testing effort is determined by the risk assessment outcome, which Matt will tell you a little bit more about in the next slides. Compliance Center will allow its users to save time and money, perform less testing and documentation, implement solutions quicker, and deliver a high quality product. So now I'm going to hand it over to Matt to tell us a little bit more about the risk assessment.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. So now I am going to go a little bit into the Compliance Center risk framework. So Compliance Center is built on a two-part risk assessment process. The first part being a system level risk assessment, which includes the operational risk. So what's the intended use of the software? It also includes the technical risk. So how complex is the system? Is it configured? Is it not configured? Is it custom? The second part is a process level risk assessment. This allows the users to determine which processes are completed within the system, which Compliance Center will offer them the proper test case format. So here we're going to get a little bit more into depth with the system level risk assessment. So to the left, there's a basic grid for the system risk assessment. It includes both the technical and operational risks that I touched on the previous slide. The concepts from the technical risks are pulled out of the GAMP5 guidelines, and the concepts from the operational risks are based out of the FDA guidance document that Hannah touched on a little bit. So once you've performed a system level risk assessment, you'll either end up in the white, orange, or red color within that grid. If you land within the white, there's no validation needed on the system. If you land within the red, you'll be performing your standard CSV that we all know. And if you land in the middle orange area, then you'll be performing a risk-based validation approach. So like I just mentioned, if you end up with a medium risk system, you'll be performing this process level risk assessment. This is a two-part risk assessment. So first you'll need to establish your risk class by determining the risk severity, which basically means what is the impact on patient safety, product quality, etc. Then you'll also need to determine the probability of failure. So is it out of box? Is it configured? Is it not configured? Will you be leveraging any vendor documentation? Once you've determined your risk class, then you can move on to the second part, which is determining your final risk priority. From here, you just need to determine the detectability of failure. How likely are you able to detect any failures? Is it very clear and obvious that something may fail? Is it very clear that nothing will fail? Or maybe you're not really sure, you need to do a little bit of investigation. So once that's determined, you'll have your final risk priority. It'll either be low, medium, or high. If you land within the low, you'll be doing something called unscripted testing. Now, unscripted testing does not mean undocumented. It just means that there's no step-by-step instructions, there's no screenshots, but you still are verifying that it works and you're checking it off within Compliance Center that it works. If you have a medium risk priority, you'll be doing something called checklist style testing. This is very similar to the traditional style of CSV testing. However, the steps aren't as detailed. You don't require screenshots and you don't need to provide any actual results. And then lastly, if you land within the high risk priority, you'll be doing your standard CSV scripting with actual results and screenshots. Okay. So here's an example of how you would perform the risk assessment for an EQMS system. So we've determined that the technical risk is a 3. It's a standard purchased configured product. We've also determined that the operational risk is a 3. So it has a moderate, we determined it has a moderate impact on production and QMS software. So as you can see on the grid, that lands us right in that orange area where the black X is, meaning that we'll be performing a risk-based validation on this EQMS system. So below are 4 processes that we came up with for the system, and of course there can be way more than 4, but for example's sake, we kept it to just 4 of them. The processes that we have determined are deviation management, audit management, complaint management, and product containment. Each of the processes listed are out of the box other than complaint management. That one is highly configured, which is why it was given the high risk priority. So for audit management, it has a risk priority of low, but we will be accepting vendor testing. So no additional testing is required because we don't want to duplicate any of the testing efforts, especially if they're already provided to us and validated. So deviation management is also another low risk priority, but we will not be accepting any of the vendor testing. And because of that, we will be doing the unscripted / ad hoc testing. Now, just to note, Not accepting vendor testing can be due for really any reasons, multiple reasons. The scope of the documentation might not be sufficient, or maybe the customer didn't purchase the entire package and it wasn't included, or simply they just didn't have it or didn't want to accept it and wanted to test it on their own. As I mentioned earlier, complaint management is highly configured, so it has a high risk priority and it'll go through the standard CSV testing. And then lastly, product containment, it's a medium risk priority and it'll go through the checklist based testing. Okay, for requirements, so once the processes are identified, they will determine what requirements are associated with each process area within Compliance Center. So each requirement within each process will have the same risk level associated with the process. And I know that sounds a little confusing, so let me try to dig into that a little bit more. So for deviation management, it was a low risk priority. So that means requirements number 1 and 2, since they're associated with that process, they'll also fall into the low risk level category and we'll go through the unscripted ad hoc testing. Complaint management, it fell within the high risk priority, and that was also a high level process area. So it'll fall into the requirement number 3 will fall into the high risk level category, and that one will go through the traditional CSV testing. And lastly, this is the test step format. So here, this is the test step format that you'll see within Compliance Center. We have a medium risk and a high risk. For the medium risk, you can see highlighted in yellow for execution. All we have is the step outcome, pass, fail, or other. And then if you look at the high risk in the yellow highlighted section, we have actual results, we have supporting evidence like screenshots, attachments, anything else you need to support the step that you're executing. Then you also have your step outcome, your pass, fail, or other. Okay, I'm going to now hand it over to Alicia for an amazing demo. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Let me switch to the system. So now I'm ready to show you guys through the system. We're going to start at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start, right? We're going to go ahead and create a system record. And this is really the heart of the whole process. Everything revolves around your system, a combination of the system name and software version. If you have multiple versions of a software, maybe you're doing an upgrade, you would handle that through distinct system records. So the system record is like the parent and everything else comes back and is related to it. So I'm just going to enter, whatever values I like. Well, 23.4. Enter a system abbreviation that's going to be used in the auto naming. And then select a system type. If I choose a custom system type, that's like something that's been developed on site or specific to us, or I can choose a vendor, and this will be something that was delivered by a software vendor. And this is just a way to track, who has it. You could also tie in to say, oh, now we have to check and make sure that this vendor is an approved vendor in our list. And then we're going to pick a system owner and write in a system description. Next, I'm going to click on the system risk information, and this is the first part of that 2-part risk assessment process. We're evaluating the technical risk category of this system as well as the operational risk category. The technical risk is assigned through whichever level that aligns with the GAMP 5 documents or GAMP 5 directive. So it's divided up in, GAMP 1, 3, 4, 5. Most of the time in life sciences, we're going to be working with configurable vendor software. But if it was something that was in-house built, you would choose the custom developed software. And then I'm going to choose what is the operational risk. What kind of risk does this overall, the entire system present to business, patient safety, product quality, all of that. I'll choose moderate impact in this case. And then based on these two that I have selected, the system's telling me, well, you got to do risk-based validation. And this is just a digital interface that goes through the grid with the three yellow, red, and white colors that Matt was showing previously on the slide. So you don't have to do it and be like, okay, where it's going to match up here. The computer will do it for you. Isn't that cool? So now I've filled out all the fields I need to. I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And the system record is in this planning lifecycle state. Now I need to get documentation. Someone needs to sign off and say, yeah, that's the right system risk assessment. So I'm going to go ahead and send this to workflow and assign a workflow recipient of myself for easy demo. And I'm going to go ahead and issue the workflow. So this system has a risk-based validation of the system risk rating. I'm going to go over to my inbox now and look at the tasks. And here is the system that I had just created. And I have a couple other ones staged because I wanted to show you the different outcomes. So this workflow is driven off of that system risk level. If I have a system here, which is in this case a no validation system, because it's just basic infrastructure, it's a modem or some router or something that you have in the office, and maybe you want to use this system to just document, oh yeah, we are evaluating all the things that we're using, and we have this documentation, and somebody is going to approve that, yeah, this is the right risk assessment. So because this one is assigned no validation, I have two options. I can reject this system record and say, no, that's not actually no validation. We need to go back and rethink that. Or I can choose to approve it and select approve no validation needed. In that case, the system record is going to promote right into in production use. You don't need to validate it. It's just going to be there and do its thing. And so that would be kind of the life cycle of that system record with no validation. Let's click back to the next one. This one is assessed as an evidence-based validation. So this is a high impact custom developed software application. So in this case, I have two options again. Of course, I can reject it and say, no, we need to reevaluate this, or I can choose to approve it and with standard scripted testing. So this is your basic, traditional CSV. You're going to do all the testing. You're going to get the screenshots. You're going to have your actual results. All that is very familiar and also something the Compliance Center can do no problem. The third scenario is where you have this risk-based validation system. And we can look at this again. It's a moderate impact, configurable vendor software. Its outcome is risk-based validation. And in this case, this is really where the CSA is. I'm making a decision as the approver. Of course, I can always reject and say, yeah, it's not right. We got to think about it again. Or I can choose, yes, we're approving this. We're going to do risk-based testing with this system. That is appropriate. Or I can say, yeah, it is risk-based system, but I'm not comfortable with that. We got to do more in-depth testing for whatever reason. And then I can choose the approved standard scripted testing. And then this system record would follow the standard CSV path and have all high risk test cases with all of the documentation and everything that you need to include. But when I choose approve risk-based testing, it's going to move to a new state where you need to evaluate the process risk, and that's the CSA piece. That's the next step of the two-step system and process risk approval. So let's go and look at a record here that has been approved. It's also risk-based validation. And if I look at the system risk approvers, I can see that this person signed off on that day for the system risk approval. And if I go to the process risk evaluation, this is the next step where we're identifying what are the different processes that this system is going to complete or support as part of our business and compliance with product quality and patient safety. So here I'm going to identify the different process names. I already have one here that's created for security and it's been evaluated to low risk priority. Maybe in this scenario, we're using a vendor supplied solution, we're using the out of the box security, and we're comfortable that the vendor testing is complete. I'm going to create a second process here. I can select process names. These are dictionary driven, so they would include, could be editable. We'll have some standard ones in here, but then anything specific to a customer system would also be able to be added. Let me choose e-signature, and now I'm going to evaluate the process risk severity. Well, that's a fine description, but I kind of forgot, and I don't want to go look at the SOP. So here I can hover over the question mark and say, oh yeah, okay, severity, impact on, come back on patient safety, product quality, data integrity, or business impact. So the overall e-signature process, yeah, it's important, but I'm going to give it a low process risk severity, right? If the e-signature were to fail, what is the patient risk high? Maybe not in this case. And then we'll look at the process failure probability. So how likely is this process to fail, right? In this case, we're using all out of the box stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and choose low again. And then based on those two values selected, I can choose the process risk class, which the system is, filtering down. Okay, well, you picked low and low. That means it's a process risk class of 3. And then I'm going to select the process failure detectability. Like how likely is it that we're going to know that the e-signature process has failed before someone gets hurt by some patient gets an negative outcome from that product or the product quality is compromised. And in this case, I'm going to say, was it likely to be detected? Is it moderately likely or is it unlikely? And I can choose maybe high in this case. Maybe nobody's going to notice that if the e-signature process fails. This is just a scenario. So based on the combination of the process risk class and the failure detectability, the system is deciding, it's only offering me the one solution or the one option, medium risk priority checklist-based testing. There's also a field to enter in mitigation activities. Maybe you would have something that you're going to say, well, this is goofy, but every single document is going to be checked by a human to make sure the e-signature is there and shows up in the audit trail. Of course, nobody's going to do that, but it could be, you have something else in place that would mitigate this level of risk for this process. So I'm going to go ahead and save that now. And now I have 2 processes evaluated, and I'll save my record here as well. And I'm going to send this again into workflow. I'll just assign my participant here and go back to the workflow. And now I have my record in pending process risk approval. I can open it up and review, all of the information. I can look at the properties on these and say, okay, yeah, I think everything is really good. I'm happy with all of this. And I can choose to approve the processes and risks. And of course, we have e-signature required on every signature that you're doing, every approval. And I can select a reason. The reason is, of course, also a dictionary. So if a customer wanted to update the values here in the reason dropdown, they could certainly do that. Now let's go back to our system record here, and it is now in process risk approved. And we can look at that system risk approvers report and say, yes, I clicked on the wrong record, sorry. Here's my record, and I can look at the process information. Oh, come on, let me refresh this. There we go. So we could look at the report here, and for some reason it's not coming up. Oh no, but it does come with the record. No, not that one. Anyhow, so you could see the approvers showing in that processes area. So you know who's approved your system risk and who's approved your process risk as well. So next, we're going to go back to the record that I just updated and created this one. And excuse me, we're going to change the state on this record into not that. So let's actually skip over to a different record here. We have, in this case, we've got our system risk defined, and we have our process risk. All of this has been approved, and our requirements have been also documented. So you can go and look at a process, and from here you can create a requirement, and it's going to inherit the process name, system name, risk, and the other system information. And you'd be able to type in your requirement as well as selecting the vendor documentation. I'm going to actually click into a different one to show. sorry, to show the properties here. So here we have one of the examples that Matt talked about where the process was audit management. If you recall, it had low risk testing assigned. It was a low risk process, but we're going to accept in this case the vendor validation documentation. So here I can select, is the vendor validation is good. I don't need to do any additional testing, or I could want to do retesting, or maybe the vendor didn't test it at all and I want to test it myself. Or maybe it's not applicable. It's not a vendor system, right? So I wouldn't have any vendor documentation to add. And then I can select from the documents that are associated to this system record, whatever that document is. So maybe I'm getting a batch of documentation from the vendor. I can import all of those documents in approved status into this system, into Compliance Center, and then I'll be able to associate those documents with the requirement where they're applicable, right? So maybe you'll have a batch of requirements that are related to audit management for your QMS system. And all those requirements are tested in the same, like 3 or 4 scripts. You can keep referencing the same documents here in the scripts. And this is going to be so exciting at the end of the demo when I show you my favorite part of Compliance Center. I think it's such a valuable add. So stay on the line so you can see the excitement. So we have also other requirements here. If we look at this requirement, it doesn't have any vendor requirement validation or vendor validation document associated. It's a high risk priority. It's that complaint management that the customer had highly customized. So we don't have any vendor documentation to tie to it. You could certainly tie that vendor documentation to it. If you wanted to say, okay, well, yeah, this is what the vendor brought to us, but we're not going to follow it. I don't know that that makes a ton of sense, but you could certainly import on the system record any of those vendor documents. So they'd be tied to that system and version. You could go back and reference them, but you don't have to tie them specifically to the test case or to the requirement that you want to test. So next we're going to look at the test cases. So once I have all of my requirements, I can also send them for approval. You can see that they're all in the lifecycle state of approved. And you can then, right click and choose to create a test case. And this is going to inherit the requirement that you had selected, some metadata from that original system record. And then you can type in your test case title and test purpose. Once your test cases are created, let's go to this draft one, we can choose to create test steps. So, oops, sorry, let's look at the properties first. So we have this complaint management test case, and then we can go to the test steps tab where we would be able to create a test case. And it's going to relate it back to the test case ID that I was selected, and it knows, what is the process risk priority for this process and for this test case, and then of course the related requirement. So here I can add a step which references a requirement. And this is, you would include this requirement reference for the specific step that is proving that requirement, right? So maybe you have some steps to get through in your test case that are just like setup steps. You wouldn't have to include the requirement that you're testing in those setup steps because you're not proving it in that step. But you would enter your step directions, your expected results, and then you could say whether e-sig is required for this step or not, and whether supporting evidence is required or not. Depending on what you choose here, it's going to give you different prompts. When the test step is being executed, you would have to add supporting evidence before you can save that test step, as well as completing the e-signature when you're saving that test step outcome. So now we have this is kind of like the whole view, right? We have our system info, we have the risk assessment for the system, we have the process risks decided, we've got our requirements documented and approved, and we have our test cases created. And this first one for deviation initiation was actually sent to pre-approval, and then it was promoted to in execution. So I want to jump over to my tasks now and go to that test step execution. So I have the overall test case. I'm the assigned tester, and we can walk through, and you can see here that both of these requirements are related to this test case. And then when we click over to the test steps, we can see that they are also shown here, right? So I have one requirement that's proven in my test step 11, and then I'll go to test step 12, and you can see that it has the different requirement that's referenced anyhow. Okay, so we'll start with test step number 1, and we'll choose to execute the test step. So I have um, my activity, what am I going to do? And in this case, it's low risk priority. So I just have my directions and expected results, and then I can say whether it passed, whether it failed. If it did fail, I need to enter whether there are deviations. If I choose yes, scroll down, then I can create a new deviation record related to this specific test step. Let me just type in 1 and login failed. Um, okay, so here I've written down, what happened and what kind of impact does it have. And then the next step would be to save this record and then create a corrective action. What am I going to do now that my step has a deviation? So let me go ahead and save that. And then I can also save this. And then I would go back through the processing process of the deviation record and send that, create my corrective action plan, send that for a pre-approval workflow. And then once the corrective action has been completed, it goes to a post-approval workflow. And then there's a decision step there as well to say, okay, well, what are we going to do? Do I need to go and re-execute that test step? Do I need to revise the whole test case? Or is this acceptable and we'll move on and send the test case for post-approval? Once I have finished, executing my test, sorry, let me save here. Oops. And then I will also have this test outcome. And here I can choose, fail if it failed, pass with exception. And then I'll complete my activity and choose that this record has passed, the test case has passed, even though we have the deviation. This is just for demo purposes. And then I'm going to enter my ESIG credentials that I have finished this test case. And now we can go back to the system record that that was related to and look over at the test cases tab. And we have this test case that has been passed and it's in the executed lifecycle state. So now I can send this to post approval. Again, selecting my participants, recipients, same thing. And then the post approvers would get to review all of the data, the deviations related, everything that is part of that test case execution and decide if it's post approved or if it needs some work. I can also update my validation deviations with that deviation that I had just created. So I can see here, it's a one-stop shop. It's my system record, but it shows you all of these different related processes. I have the requirements, I have the test cases, and then I can also see any system-related validation deviation, as well as the lifecycle state, right? So that's a big overview of the system record where all of the work happens in the system. But then the most exciting thing, this is my favorite thing that I had alluded to before, we have an out-of-the-box default trace matrix report. So I can select my system name and system version. And here I'm going to get the trace matrix. It's going to say, okay, here we have your process name, your deviation management, the requirement that's related to that process. And then as you scroll over, you can see, okay, what test case tested that and what state is that test case in. And depending on how it's set up, you could also have the test step ID, right? So this specific requirement was tested in this test case and this specific step. Where the document, or excuse me, where the requirement has the vendor documentation that you're leveraging, it's going to include that vendor document number in this report. So one of the worst not experiences, but one of the most painful processes is bringing that trace matrix together at the end of the project where you're like, okay, we just got to go to production, but we got to make sure everything's ready. it's one click, it's there, it's real time, so you can always check in on this traits matrix report and kind of get an overall view of like what's going on with the whole validation and kind of to chase the things that need to be chased. And then look at it and be like, hey, nobody had to do any work. Well, we didn't have to do any hands-on work, right? The back end work of the report and defining all the parameters has been done for you. So that just about completes the process here, the demo that I wanted to show. I think we can segue into the Q&A session now.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you to the FME team for sharing the concepts, features, and benefits of FME Compliance Center. This looks like a powerful tool for those of us who have been doing all this through paper processes for so many years. We'll now be answering some of your questions. So whatever you have, please be sure to put them into the questions panel. If we don't have time to get to them all, we will follow up with you individually. So let's get started here. The first question I have for the team is, can the Compliance Center platform be used for other validation activities or only for projects where FME does the validation?
I'll take that one. Great question. Thanks, Brian. So the Compliance Center platform is intended to be a multi-purpose tool set. So we certainly use it on all our projects, whether we're validating software or we're verifying or validating migrated data. We'll use it as our tool set rather than Excel and paper or OneDrive and so forth because of all the power that Alicia just demonstrated, right? It's a great tool for us. However, we see a number of clients that are using Dropbox, SharePoint, Box.net, whatever the platform may be today, and they have a need for their own quality management system, their own QMS that they can use to store validation content and other related documents. And so we certainly see this being used by our clients in their own efforts that we may not be directly involved in. So we host it for ourselves, we host it for our clients, and our clients then can take it and use it as they wish going forward to do validation on their own or to expand on work we've done with them or what have you. So yes, we see it as a multifaceted tool that we would use ourselves as well as our clients could then use long term.
Super. Thank you, David, for that. Our next question for this is, if we do traditional CSV testing because of the risk assessment, is there still value in using Compliance Center?
Another good one. And the conversations that Alicia and I have had about this. Let me see. Alicia, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, sure. So the solution is developed with an idea that we can, you can leverage CSA, you can follow that new guidance to reduce the amount of testing you have to do. But we also see that there's a lot of stuff that you're not going to want to use CSV or CSA for, excuse me. And maybe sometimes there's like a business disconnect, I think, where a certain team is like, yeah, we should totally use CSA. This is the greatest. And then a different team maybe is not really comfortable with it yet because it is draft guidance at this point. So the system has been built, configured, and designed with the idea that you can use this system for high risk only. You can use every single time. You can say, well, this is a risk-based system, sure, but all the processes are high risk, and we're just not comfortable with that risk level. So we're going to do the full standard scripted testing, and it's going to be great. And it's all going to be there for you. It'll have all of your standard, e-signatures required, as well as screenshots and everything. So it can totally support the CSV approach as well as the CSA approach. And it can also be distinct. If you have one system that you're validating that you're comfortable with CSA, you can have a separate system that you're validating that you're not comfortable with CSA, and you can follow CSV in this Compliance Center solution. So it's perfect and amazing. It'll do anything you want.
Love the enthusiasm. Brian, but if there are any other questions, let me insert a little follow on to that because the thought occurred to me that perhaps our listeners are worried that the validation results and that magic trace matrix that Alicia was so excited to show are locked into the system. But I want to emphasize that in all cases, we have complete ability to extract all the outputs. So all the test scripts can come out, all the requirements, all the trace matrix and so forth can be produced in electronic format that can be extracted from the solution and stored in your own environment outside of Compliance Center when the work is done, if that is your choice. Or they can be stored online, to follow up on that first question, and stay and maintain there in a QMS for new releases and so forth that are coming along.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for those answers. So this is the last question we have at the moment. Is this a validated solution, and do you provide a package?
It's definitely validated. And Matt, you were the first to bring up about vendor documentation. Perhaps you'd like to answer that one?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So to answer the question, yes, this is a validated solution. We have all of the documentation actually ready within Compliance Center. So if you would ever like to review it, access it and review it, it's there for you, ready to go.
Thank you, Matt.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we don't see any more questions at this time, so we'll wrap it up here. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed learning more about FME Compliance Center and recognize how it can save you substantial time and effort. If you are interested, we can set up a personalized demonstration for you and your team to go deeper into specific features. As always, we will send you a link to slides and the recording after this webinar, and we'll be happy to answer any additional questions you may have. On behalf of our speakers and the entire FME team, thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you all.